I'm Jeffrey Tobias from the Strategy Group. Thanks for joining us. We've got 45 minutes. We'll keep this conversational and we'll leave space for your questions at the end. Please use the chat freely. Your comments will help steer the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we broadcast today, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. Let me introduce our panel quickly. Martin Stewart-Weeks from Public Purpose works with governments deploying AI in high-stake environments. Satya Tanwer from St Vincent de Paul Society, New South Wales, navigates AI where vulnerable people can't afford mistakes. Hoffman heads AI at the Strategy Group, my company, and helps organisations figure out where AI actually adds value and where it doesn't. All three of these illustrious people are deploying AI while grappling with exactly the trust questions we're here to discuss. So, why are we here? The historian Yuval Noah Harari says, artificial intelligence is a risk to humankind's most valuable resource, trust. And that's what we're here to discuss. Yet, for some reason, we're pouring billions into it, adopting it everywhere, becoming dependent on it. Let's be honest, we've no idea what biases are really baked into these systems. We're taking advice from faceless algorithms with zero clue who or what is behind them. We can't know who's a real human and who's a fake. We've all of us watched AI confidently generate complete nonsense, fabrications, errors, dangerous misinformation. And what do? We click copy, we click paste, and off goes that document. Think about that. If an employee repeatedly lied to you, you'd fire them. If your life partner betrayed your trust, the relationship will collapse. But AI makes errors regularly, and we don't even really know what happens to our sensitive files after we've uploaded them. So here's the uncomfortable question. If we can't trust AI, why are we so desperate to hand the keys of it to everything? Before we go further, let's do a quick reality check. Type yes in the chat if you've used AI for work in the last week. Just type yes. Any of you used AI for work in the last week, type yes in the chat. Okay, bunch of responses. Okay, lots of yeses. Now type okay if you actually read the terms of service before you used it, or if you know exactly what happens to your data after you hit submit. Not much. That's the trust gap we're talking about. We're all in this together. So Martin, you work with government leaders racing to deploy AI they don't understand, to solve problems they can't articulate, with money they don't have. Is that courage, Martin, or is that institutional delusion?
Yeah, what an enticing proposition. Golly gosh. Hi, Jeff. Hi, everybody. It's terrific to be here. Such a great conversation. I've decided there's always a good time to have a conversation about AI on the basis that the conversation changes about every hour and a half, as far as I can work out, if I'm trying to follow the feeds on my agenda, on my emails anyway. It's fantastic. And it's also, of course, very interesting. Tomorrow, Tuesday, the national government, our federal government at last, is going to put out its national AI strategy, as I read it. And there's a few little early signs this morning about what might be in that document. So terribly good time. So is it courage or delusion? I don't think it's either of those two things. At least I hope it's not. It certainly isn't institutional delusion, I think, but it is a sign of two things, in my view. One is that This is a set of technology developments that is, it's always unprecedented, isn't it? But it is raising problems that I don't think governments have seen before. The scale and size and speed and intensity of what's going on. But it's not just that. It's just that unlike the internet revolution of about 30 odd years ago, or whenever it was, and some of us unhappily are old enough to have lived through all of that, this time around, there's a sense that this new set of technologies is foundationally shifting the way we deal with knowledge and information and data, which of course is the lifeblood of government. That's what governments do. So I think there's a sense of anxiety about the scale of what's going on here. The world seems to be shifting on its axis. Therefore, the second issue kicks in, which is if you're in government, the first thing you need to really worry about is care. You have to be very careful about what you do and how you respond, because people's lives are at stake and a lot of other things are at stake, including things like trust and confidence in government and so on. So there's this kind of anxiety that is born, I think, by the desire to get on to these new platforms and learn more about them. And certainly my experience in and with government is that people are very keen to do that. Some of it's happening informally, more of it is happening formally. But you want to do it at a speed which provides you with some sense that you are being as careful as you can be. So it's a bit of a tense struggle, I guess, to know therefore how far and how fast you should move. But yeah, I certainly don't think there's a sense of delusion, but I think there is a sense of anxiety about how in government you square the circle, if that's the right way of putting it, where you know you want to move fast and you want to get onto this new capability, but you have a series of quite legitimate, and speaking as a citizen, you'd want governments to be a little bit careful about how they do it. And in between those two things, a little bit of tension, I think.
So, Martin, you talk about anxiety. Are you anxious?
I am getting increasingly anxious about both the power of this new capability, which I'm thoroughly enjoying to some extent, to the extent I know what I'm doing, given all your other earlier comments earlier. But I am a bit anxious about the extent to which we are playing so obviously catch up to a set of capabilities that is moving at a speed and intensity that certainly the public realm finds quite difficult to match. Yeah, so there is a bit of anxiety there, I think. That seems to me to be highly rational, I have to say, but others on the score might have slightly different views. So yes, I'm sensibly anxious, I hope is the view, without being silly about it.
Okay, maybe that's the term for the next year, sensibly anxious. So Satya, Martin talked about lives being at stake. Your organisation serves vulnerable people experiencing homelessness, domestic violence, mental health issues. You know, building on what Martin said, if AI gets it wrong, real people get hurt. So why are you deploying these systems that you can't even fully explain?
Well, there are a number of reasons, and as I think it is definitely the term of the week, sensibly anxious.
Sense of anxious.
There's this real dichotomy where we have the need for building capabilities on an ongoing basis where we can deal with, contracting workforce and increasing needs. So these are opposing and converging forces in many ways, where the social need, because of cost of living and homelessness crisis, is increasing the need for social services, and workforce is contracting quite substantially. So we find ourselves in a place where inaction is just not an option for us. And then it leads to the second part of being sensibly anxious and being very considerate about how we deploy this technology. And Martin very rightly pointed out, this is one of those technological advances that are really hard to sort of keep track of because it's evolving so fast. And this is where I take comfort in the fact that as a social service, we can be a bit considered and a bit of a follower. For example, doctors in medical offices are now using multimodal AI sort of agents to transcribe the conversations they're having with their patients. These are tried and tested AI agents that are being deployed. There's privacy and compliance considerations all being factored into those solutions. So we're a bit of taking a follower type of approach in how we consider leaning into these things, keeping in mind the vulnerability of the people we assist. So it's a constant balance that we have to strike, and our objective is around augmenting humans as opposed to replacing humans, which is a different narrative that plays out in for-profit organizations.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's interesting, Liam. We've heard a bit of a discussion from the not-for-profit sector. We've heard a bit of discussion from the public sector. You're across a whole lot of vertical markets in terms of what you do at the strategy group. What do you feel that's really driving adoption faster than trust? Because it is. Is it, people's really busy, they need to do this? Is it shadow AI, they're doing it under the table anyway? Is it push from all the vendors we all know? Or is it the leadership going FOMO, if we don't do this, we better get into it? What are you seeing?
Yeah, Jeffrey, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's a mix. It's not just coming from one direction. You've got the leaders who've probably experienced, the magic of AI firsthand, the ChatGPT moment. I think you've then got power users as well and champions within organizations who are sort of evangelizing the technology. And I think you've also got that board level pressure to not be left behind, right? All of this is, I guess, creating momentum to adopt without actually, in my view, allowing enough time to fully understand what they're dealing with. And what they often don't understand are those limitations. I mean, you spoke about at the beginning, error rates, it's between 5 and 40%, depending on the task and model. There's inconsistency in the performance of models. And what I mean by that is you could get different quality outputs based on server load, usage patterns, things like that. And then there's obviously the infrastructure issue. Many organizations who are more cautious about this are thinking the safest deployment is often an in-house bespoke AI model or something like that, not realizing the actual cost and compute to actually get that in order. But just to acknowledge, I guess, what's happening, the hype is real, usage is rising, and that's sort of forcing adoption, whether organizations are ready or not. But in the midst of the nervous anxiousness, I think what's the opportunity? For me, it's really getting started by focusing on that awareness and education first, and in parallel, looking at policy and governance, which can, I think, be quite well informed these days with the number of, as Martin mentioned, something being released tomorrow in relation to the AI strategy, but also just excellent sort of national and global frameworks, whether it's in Australia or more globally as well. So yeah, that's my opinion.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we've got sensibly anxious and we've got nervous anxious. So everyone's very anxious at the moment. And look, let's name what we're dancing around trust. I mean, some of you here because your CEO told you to do something with AI. Others because your competitors are, and you feel you got to do something, and your competitors are, you'll be left behind. But I put it to you that almost none of us are here, us, not just you, us, because we've actually nailed the trust problem. And that's okay because that's why we're having this conversation. So I appreciate that. Look, let's come back to trust and make trust tangible. Satya, in mission-led organizations such as your own, how is trust built? How do you build trust in practice? And what should AI leaders learn from what you've done in the past around building trust?
There are two parts to it, Martin. There's the pre-AI and the post-AI answer to it. Conventionally, trust is built through transparency, and economists have studied this world over for a good 2-3 decades, that markets and people tend to have this inherent need for transparency in order for the trust to be built, and markets and infrastructures to remain viable. And AI brings this unique problem for all of us where, to your point at the very beginning, algorithms are making inferences on observable and unobservable data that human beings cannot understand. They don't have the inference powers that these models possess, and they're these models are improving every day through reinforced data, which is, again, something, it becomes an uneven exchange between humans and a machine. And the use of AI or shadow use of AI, i.e., this is unprecedented, because when OpenAI released its first ChatGPT models now in 2022, if memory serves me right, the democratization of this capability has forced organizations to take notice a lot more than anything else. It's the shadow use of AI by employees and sort of blurring the line between where sensitive data sits. And therefore, when it comes to the matter of trust, it's about building trust in the systems that we deploy, the AI solutions that we are looking at deploying, because that transparency is not replaceable. How are we using the data? How are we making simple decisions based on the input that's being provided is very important to building that trust. And that's how we are leaning in. And that's how the sector is looking at it as well. Do we have due governance and policies in place such that people can interact with and understand the use of AI in the organization, and how the data is being treated is quite crucial.
Look, I think, due governance and policies is a whole topic in itself. We'll come to that a little later. Satya, thank you. I mean, Martin, we talk about the social sector, but we've seen from things like robo-debt that government technology failures can destroy lives. So what is there something fundamentally broken here about how public institutions deploy technology? I mean, is it broken, or is this just what happens when accountability is diffuse?
Yeah, it's a little bit of the latter, I think. I know there are people who will argue, and I've met them and I've worked with some of them, who will argue that almost definitionally, the public sector just can't handle large, complicated technology shifts. You and I know that story over 30 or 40 years. I think it's a little unfair. I think it's a little unfair in the sense that there are always some, there are some big stories that people latch onto where things clearly did not go well. I want to just step back a minute, because Satya's just made some really important points that I want to reinforce and give a couple of examples. I want to step back to a much more general principle, particularly for the public space. And the general principle is that invention has always outstripped regulation. Always. Doesn't matter whether you go back to, inventing aeroplanes or cars or the Industrial Revolution. Things happened and people started to behave in ways which the rest of us, when we got hold of what was going on, said, oh, no, that's not a good idea. We need to put some control on that. It's not a good idea to put 8-year-old boys up chimneys. All right. It's not a good idea to spew all your crap out into the River Thames. We're going to stop all that. Now, you could argue it took rather a long time to get some of those things done, and a lot of people had to work very hard to put some of those guardrails around. But gradually, what you saw through these big transitions is technology and invention takes off almost unstoppably. And the rest of us, and certainly on our behalf, government looks at them and says, oh, no, I don't quite like the way that's all going. Let's just start pulling that back a bit. So I think that's kind of what's going on now. Now, there's a pretty lively argument, and I've been in the middle of some of them in relation to people in the public space, whether, it's almost too late to start doing that this time around, because this set of transitions seems to be so big and so unstoppable and so unquestionable that the whole idea that somehow you'd start to rein it back a bit, is almost fanciful. I think that's not true. I think what I'm hearing from governments, and if you look at what's going on in the federal government at the moment, you look at the New South Wales story recently, in recent years, led by Victor Dominello when he was there as the minister, he has tried, many people are trying to pull together pieces of this new regime, which is partly about good governance. It is partly about transparency. It's about being a little bit more obviously careful. I think that's what Services Australia is trying to do at the moment. I remember a speech that David Hazelhurst, the CEO there, not all that long ago, gave, where he set out very clearly where Services Australia would play, where it wouldn't play, where it was going to allow some experimentation, and when it quite evidently was not going to allow some experimentation, particularly when there was decisions that affected very, very vulnerable people, the very people that Satya's organisation often looks after. So I think we're getting there is some rebalancing going on. Of course, the other thing I'll quickly throw into the mix, just to kind of pick up a pretty obvious and very topical, look what's happening around Australia's social media ban for kids. I mean, I read a big, long article just over the weekend from the UK press about the extent to which the rest of the world is watching that story, because everyone knows that where social media has gone to for kids who are under 16 is not a good place. It's just, now, question is what to do about it, and we're having a go. That's the dynamic that's at play now. And I think it's always been that way. And I guess I am at the stage where I'm going to put a fair bit of faith in our collective ability gradually, and it's not an easy game because there are huge interests at stake here and vast amounts of money. But nonetheless, it is possible to start reining this stuff back in to say, hang on a minute, there is a collective framing here that is legitimate, and we are going to work at it, and we are going to start putting it in place. So we're in the middle of that process. It's very messy. It's very uncomfortable. Hence, good to be anxious, but let's be sensible about it. We're going to make progress. We're not all going to just, throw up our hands in horror and tell everyone that the world is coming to an end. It's not coming to an end, but we've got to be careful, and we've got to do that work.
Yeah, look, I think your parallel between what's happening in social media is a really interesting one. And as you mentioned, there are huge amounts of money behind it, as there's huge amounts of money behind AI as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Liam, we've talked about sort of trust and what happens from the outside. What does trust failure look like from the inside, from inside an organization? Not the headline version, but when something's gone wrong internally around operational reality, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think we need to break that down into sort of two parts. One is where do organizations sort of overtrust AI, and where do they undertrust it and actually miss the opportunities? In terms of overtrust, I'd still say research, information retrieval search is a bit of a danger zone that has definitely spiraled into reputational damage for a lot of organizations. But again, that comes back to that deeper issue around the people that are using it don't necessarily understand how these technologies actually work. A really good sort of demo that I saw recently is, in terms of how AI works, is asking an LLM, any LLM, ChatGPT, Claude, to pick a random number between 1 and 10. It'll almost always, like over 90%, give you a 7. Then you ask it to give you another number between 1 and 10, and it'll give you a 3 or a 4 every time. And I think that's just because this technology works off tokens. It predicts the next best word based on its contextual knowledge base. So what it's doing is just pattern matching at an enormous scale. And I think once we truly understand that, we understand how to be in control of the way we speak to the machine, and it works in a way that works best. And we start to understand, as you said at the beginning, why it generates confident, well-formatted outputs in an authoritative way that may be completely fabricated. And I guess a good example of this in the headline is the Deloitte situation a couple of months ago. But I guess just coming back to the research risk, one easy tip that's always suggested is to use multiple models to cross-check or verify information. And then we get into another problem there where if you're providing a directed task and still have to cross-check and verify things internally, what's the value of AI? Is it actually cutting down sort of that repetitive task? Is it cutting down that time to make more meaningful time for you? Not really. So I think you need to ask whether the productivity gain is real, once you factor in the verification. And that obviously requires testing with your power users, your non-users regularly, against some well-defined metrics. On the other side of that, though, and we all probably know this, is the unglamorous tasks are really where AI excels, and where shadow AI users already sort of figured out. Writing assistance, summarization, the blank canvas problem, translation, those high frequency tasks where the error rate is forgivable, but the productivity gain is real, that's where it's at. And I guess the irony, I know MIT has been coming out with some controversial research, but I think saw recently that they had one where it's 90% of employees are using personal AI tools at work.
Yeah.
That's often shadow AI. And often the higher ROI is with those people rather than official enterprise deployments, right? And so those power users understand AI, they understand where it fits. And I think that's the biggest key, is that organizations who actually want to adopt this technology need to surface that expertise instead of fighting shadow AI in any way. And I guess there's another real irony in that organizations are pouring resources into these ambitious pilots while ignoring that the simple wins that are already with the people that have figured it out for themselves. I hope that answers your question.
It's a great point. Jeff, can I just very quickly jump in? Data point.
You can.
If you look at the new AI plan that's just come out from the Department of Finance in Canberra, taking Liam's part, that's exactly one of the pillars that they picked up. What they're saying to the new AI accountable officer, a chief AI officer in every agency, is go and find the people who are already solving the problem and help to make their work more systemic across your agency. They don't use that language, but what they picked up exactly Liam's point. I think it's a brilliant insight and an absolutely crucial one. If you're in a situation where, as it turns out, people are basically going out there to do the work that you want them to do, which is to find out how to use this stuff. And the only way you can use this stuff, by the way, is not to have too many seminars about it. You have to go and use it. You have to go and work. And that's certainly what I'm learning, much to my horror occasionally. But what the federal government is saying is a chief AI officer in the Department of XYZ now in Canberra, we're expecting you to go and find those people and go and work with them and harness their knowledge and their expertise. That is a real plus for you. Don't see it as a problem. Sorry, I really wanted to jump in there because it's a really powerful observation.
Look, it's an excellent observation. Thank you. And let me build on the point of going out and using it. So if as you say, everyone's encouraged to go out and do it and use it, building also on what Liam mentioned, what are we going to do? Because how do we check every AI output? It's fine if we're sort of reshaping an email or we're reshaping a little document, but if, for example, we're building, a model, a mathematical model for the future of the organization for the next 10 years, what do we do? How do we trust it? Do we spot check everything? Do we put in so many guardrails that we're actually stymied from doing it at all? If we building systems and depending on the output of the AI, to Martin's point, that we've been encouraged to use, what do we do, Liam? What do you think? How do we actually manage trust at scale?
Before Liam answers, I think there's also another slightly contrarian view as well. It's really amazing to have the super users supported. But what it does is it creates this deeper inequality, because as AI sort of gets to scale, then you will have the super users who can really take advantage and sort of have that premium charge for their services, for their capabilities, and then there's the rest of the workforce that would be left behind. So it's important to harness this, but there needs to be equally that balanced consideration to everybody else as well. There's that level of education that needs to be lifted such that the wave can sort of lift the boat.
Yeah, agreed.
Look, I think balance is a really good word. Martin, did you want to comment?
No, Liam, go ahead, Liam, mate.
Look, just to answer your question, Jeff, and I guess it builds on your point that was sort of going to be my answer, Satya, is, you can't review every output. You just can't. And so the question becomes, where do you place those trust checkpoints and who holds them? And that's where the education is really crucial, because it's not just about what AI produces, but how it works. When people understand AI's process for ingesting, responding to outputs, they become better at knowing when to trust versus when to verify. And yes, power users are going to be the key to get us to trust at scale, because these are the people who figured out where AI works and where it doesn't. So I do believe that they do need to, I guess, be empowered to set standards, create the prompts, build the templates, and then their confidence needs to be extended to their teams and the other people. The other point, which we brought up earlier, is there's a paradox here in that how do you actually educate while also keeping up with the advances in this technology? Because there's no perfect playbook. It changes every day. We had Opus 4.5 released last week, we had Gemini the week before. I think once you've identified the AI tools you're ready to adopt after governance, there's a need for greater resources from the vendors you're using, but also the idea of creating a safe sandbox environment where people can access and actually play with it, and then that encouragement. I think that's where it's at.
Yeah, I mean, if it was up, if I was, there is just a few basic elements you've got to put in place, and then to some extent you do have to start to recognize the need to work in very rapid cycles of iterative learning, to use a rather clumsy phrase. There's no question in my mind that part of the trick here is to recognize that the speed with which your organization learns and feeds that learning back is going to be absolutely crucial. I'm constantly reminded in these conversations about a brilliant book I read by a sort of early internet philosopher, a guy called David Weinberger, who wrote this book about 11 or 12 years ago, maybe a bit more now, called Too Big to Know, where the facts aren't the facts, experts are everywhere, and then the other subtitle is, and when the smartest person in the room is the room. And part of what I think we've got to understand here is that too much of this experimentation is happening without appropriate visibility. People are not sharing what they're doing. That's not okay. Now, that doesn't mean to say that I can sit there and say, I need to be across everybody's experiment. I mean, I will literally blow up, before breakfast. But the point is, you can't progress this conversation unless you're working in an atmosphere, which of course I think is one of the great sort of new ways of working that we do hear a lot about from the design world and so on, which is to work in the open. You've got to show people what you're doing, because more and more people can at least then have that visibility and say, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. So you've got to be prepared to make your work more visible and therefore more, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of actionable by other people. I think that's another thing. But I've just come to my general point. The speed with which organizations learn is going to be absolutely crucial, because you can't regulate everything, and you shouldn't, and you can't check everything, and you can't. But the rate at which you learn and feedback, whoops, that didn't work, I need to tell everybody, don't do that again, or wow, I've just had the most incredible breakthrough. Here are the 5 things I did. Put that back into the pool, into the pot, and everyone gets to benefit from that. The speed and sophistication with which we get that learning cycle going, I reckon, is going to be absolutely crucial. And that's true for every organization, in my view.
Absolutely. I think, if we can't do that and keep up, as Liam said, the volume of releases on a nightly and daily basis is massive. So how do we keep up with that? Look, I'm interested to go to questions. But before we go to questions, I just want to test something. If your AI system made a significant error tomorrow, right? So you're in an organization, you've used AI, significant error, wrong medical device, a wrong credit decision, a wrong hiring recommendation. 3 questions to you, or to the audience. Could you detect it happened? Could you explain why it happened? And could you prevent happening again? And my point to you, and we'll go to questions now, if you answered no to any of these, you actually don't have a trust problem. You've got a governance crisis. And just keep that in mind as we go to questions. So let's see who we've got. Let's Yep, we've got some comments.
There actually.
Yeah. The comment here, who are the people that would be my question at work, at school, at retirement villages, to keep it extreme? The pace needs to be controlled in education and other basic adjustments across the board. Too much experimentation for sure, and private, economic, not social friendly tool or accessible to all. So any comments on that comment?
Yeah, there's a couple of very quick ones I'd make, if I've understood the comment, and I think it's a good one at the core. There are some important elements that are becoming clearer, I think, about ways in which we set out some fundamental expectations about the way we're going to engage this new technology. I remember when in the days when Rishi Sunak was the Prime Minister of Britain, whenever the hell that was, an awful long time ago. It wasn't actually all that long, as you know. And he ran the AI, safety summit, the global one. In the communique from that meeting, there was this phrase about how AI had to be developed for the good of all, for good and for all. And I think we do have to think very carefully about where people are playing. The other thing, the story that always reminds me when I hear these kinds of comments, and I think it's a very important one, is some amazing work, and Satya, you may know at least similar sort of stories, was actually being run with a bunch of refugee women, basically teaching them how to use AI, essentially, and incredibly powerful and very successful. And they loved it, and they were finding 110 different ways to use these new technologies in their particular world of work or with their kids or what have you. So I think we've got to understand, we've got to recognize that if you put the time and effort and you have the mindset that says we do have to bring everybody with us with proper and appropriate ways of education and training and development, we can make some progress, and we shouldn't assume that any particular group of society is somehow unable or unwilling or incapable of coming along for the journey. But that it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes resources.
Yeah, thank you. Look, here's
Well said.
Sorry, Satya, please.
No, well said, Martin. And I just want to add to it as well. Given the world we live in, everything is headline news within 2 hours. There is a real need for us to separate the frontier technology from the commoditized technology. And I think that that separation is quite important in how we interact with this innovation as a whole, because when the next version of Sora comes out, it's on our feeds, it's in the news, it's the next best thing. And that's where this information overload is creating or adding to the anxiety that people feel about this innovation. If you look at the base models, there is a lot that can be achieved through simple education. And I think that separation is quite crucial. But I hadn't heard of that case study, Martin. I'll have to go and dig it out, look it
Yeah,
up.
no, I can find it for you. It's very, very powerful. I've heard them speak about it. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think, you know, we think about the electric vehicle. I mean, what I put this to you, Satya. So if something goes wrong, right, who do we blame? And from a not-for-profit sector, it's even more important. Do we blame the organization? Do we blame the algorithm? Do we blame OpenAI? When something goes wrong, who are we going to blame?
Well, I'm very comfortable saying that we are using AI solutions in the backdrop, i.e. low fidelity use cases, for that very reason, because we haven't really trialed our governance and road tested it. But also it's not very dissimilar to how you have the autonomous vehicle software issue. You know, regulation is still grappling with if there is an autonomous vehicle in a collision, who ultimately bears responsibility. It's the problem with AI related issues aren't very dissimilar to that. If we were to use AI models for client information and it was to make a horrendous mistake, corporate access, we're accountable, but there is a cascading set of responsibilities that go all the way through to where the LLM was built. And to the degree that we understood and had explainability in it as we looked at deploying it, and did we have governance and policies in place to respond to a mistake like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an interesting question here I would put to you. I think that what you've indicated is that the situation is uncontrollable, and it's only when things go drastically wrong that there'll be regulation. Liam, do you think that's right?
I want to say no, but sometimes that's just human nature, right? We don't, you may go, hey, this guy that lives next door to me, he looks suspicious. Call the police, and they come check it out. They think it's nothing because he hasn't done anything wrong, right? But until he does something wrong, it's not really an issue. And I think it's the same sort of principle here.
Yeah.
I think where we can move to, though, and what we've seen sort of travel well across sectors is, as Satya mentioned at the beginning, transparency about AI use is key. People need to know when AI is involved in producing an output of any sort, because I think that's where the trust starts. And transparency sets the appropriate expectations. I think there was another comment in the comment section around education, and I think, as I mentioned before as well, the idea of human in the loop versus AI in the loop is really, really important when it comes to using AI. And it's not just about distrust, it's about appropriate oversight. Models are good, they have error rates, they're good for internal tasks, it's all manageable, but for any external outputs that carry reputation, a human checkpoint needs to be non-negotiable. And I know there's a small things of what you've asked around, whether regulations will come up, but I just think those are important principles to keep in mind as we sort of navigate this as it goes forward.
Let me just jump in there too. I mean, Ruben's question's a very good one. I mean, generally speaking, the answer is no, you don't have to wait till things go wrong. In fact, that's not what's happening. Certainly, if you look at what's happening at the federal level, go back to my story about Victor and the package of things that he put together in New South Wales was a distinct, genuine attempt to say, this is really powerful, stuff. We've got to put some kind of framework together. The Europeans, of course, and we've all been following that conversation for a long time, have been putting a very complex and detailed regulatory framework, some might argue overly, and so on and so forth. So no, I don't think we have to just sit here and wait for the thing to blow up and then say, oh dear, we better stop that happening again. That will happen. There's no question. There's always that risk of bad things happening, and then everyone says, quick, we've got to regulate it. But I think there is a growing expectation that as much as we can, and it's not an easy process and it's not a simple process in terms of timing, we have got to get to the point where we are putting in place regulatory frameworks that are not simply sitting there waiting for the next crisis. In fact, trying very much to head that off at the pass. There's a couple of other comments in the chat that I think are very important to draw out too, and that is the extent to which, and I'm just beginning to delve into this conversation, what is generally and often referred to, although some people find this terminology difficult, the global south, by which I mean countries like South America, Africa, India, Asia, are actually having really very complex and fascinating conversations, which are effectively saying, you know what, we can actually figure some of this stuff out in ways which make a lot more sense to us and the cultures and the situations we're in, and we're going to do it. And we don't have to be essentially beholden to the rhythms and and some might say that deeply dysfunctional rhythms to some extent of what's being pumped out of Silicon Valley every night and every morning and every week. And I think that relationship between the way in which countries like Australia is trying to navigate its way through and perhaps listening overly much to a particular point of view, which tends to come from broadly the global north, I think is being changed. And I think that is shifting in ways that I'm beginning to find, and I'm exploring it myself at the moment, I think very encouraging and very, very hopeful.
I agree with you, Martin. I think that there is this huge amount of groundswell of innovative mindset shifts within the global south, and the opportunity is absolutely abundant given the proportion of populations that are distributed across these two geographical regions, and the promise of AI around optimization and finding new productive ways. I think this is a bit of a balance shift of where the innovations are being adopted and driven from. Equally, I'm actually observing it very carefully.
Yeah, thank you. And Liam, closing comment briefly?
Closing comments?
Yes.
Look, I think it's been a really good discussion. Trust is obviously a big issue. A lot of good comments there as well, which we could dive into a bit more in another forum. I think I'm trying to make this I'm trying to think about it as practically as possible. And I just think that, look, AI is being used everywhere. I'm sure you've seen the MIT studies around, 95% of pilots fail to scale. I think there's a lot of operational questions that aren't answered up front that could mitigate that. Defining what good looks like. There's just so much to touch on here in such little time. It's been a great conversation. I think trust is a really big issue and something that we're all sort of navigating through together. But it's been really enjoyable to hear those cross-industry perspectives.
Yeah, look, thank you. I'd really like to, in closing, thank the panelists, Martin, Satya, Liam. It's been a fabulous conversation. Look, we started with a paradox. If we can't trust AI, then why do we want so much more of it? That's where we started. Maybe the answer is we don't need to trust the machine. We need to trust the humans who deploy it, who govern it, and know when to override it. And that's you. If you want to be that kind of an organisation, the strategy group, we can help. Get in touch. Thanks so much for being here.